There was a lemon on the rough-hewn table. It was bright yellow, thick-skinned, and smelled faintly of oil and summer. 3 inches away, on the other side of the frost-blackened windowpane, the world was ending. It was January 12th, 1888, the day the Great Plains froze solid in the span of a single afternoon. Cattle died standing up in the fields. Coal fires choked out in sawed houses. But in this room, the thermometer read a steady 65 degrees. There was no stove, no fire, no coal. It wasn't magic that kept the frost off that lemon. It was a specific mastery of weight, water, and the memory of the sun buried 6 feet deep. Ezra spent the mild autumn of 1887 doing everything wrong. While the rest of the territory was cutting hay and stacking dried buffalo chips for the winter burn, Ezra was moving earth. He wasn't a farmer in the traditional sense. He was a man who looked at the open prairie and saw a geometry problem waiting to be solved. The neighbors called his project the Grave on the Hill. It was a deep, violently deliberate scar cut into the south-facing slope of his claim. To the men riding by on their wagons, it looked like a mistake. It looked like a way to invite the damp in, a damp that would rot your lungs and freeze your bones before the snow even fell. They didn't understand the depth. Ezra wasn't just digging a root cellar. He was hunting for a specific temperature. On the plains, the frost line sits at 36 inches. Above that line, the soil is a slave to the weather, freezing hard as iron in January and baking to dust in July. But if you go deeper, past the 3-foot mark, the soil forgets the season. Down there, the earth maintains a constant, indifferent temperature of 50 to 55 degrees. It doesn't matter if the wind chill is 40 below or the heat index is 100. Ezra moved tons of soil by hand, wheelbarrow by heavy wheelbarrow, chasing that stability. He wasn't trying to heat a house. He was trying to connect a room to the thermal battery of the planet. The cut itself was precise. He didn't dig straight down. He carved the slope at an angle that looked erratic to the untrained eye. But Ezra had done the math using a surveyor's transit and a notebook filled with solar declination tables. He knew the sun in January didn't hang overhead. It crawled along the southern horizon, low and weak. A normal roof reflects that glancing light away. Ezra's cut was designed to catch it. He shaped the earth to accept the low arc of the winter solstice sun, inviting it deep into the belly of the hill, while rejecting the high, scorching sun of midsummer. It was a filter made of dirt, designed to drink in the light only when the world was dying for heat. The men in town laughed when he ordered the glass. They laughed when he spent his hard currency on iron pipe instead of anthracite coal. They were betting their lives on active heat, on the ability to keep feeding a fire, hour after hour, against a wind that could suck the warmth out of a cast iron stove in minutes. They trusted things they could burn: wood, corn cobs, dried dung. If the fuel ran out, or if the chimney drafted backward, the heat stopped. That was the equation they lived by. It was a fragile, high-maintenance existence. Ezra didn't trust fuel. Fuel was finite. He trusted mass. He trusted the fact that heat, once captured, could be hoarded like grain in a silo. He built his walls not to keep the weather out, but to keep the energy in. While his neighbors were chinking their log cabins against the draft, Ezra was sealing his structure against the sky itself. He knew that the battle wasn't against the cold. The battle was against the loss of heat. The engine of Ezra's machine wasn't a boiler, and it wasn't a stove. It was the room itself. If you stripped away the soil and the roof, what remained would look less like a house and more like a fortress designed to withstand a siege. The rear wall, the one built against the north face of the cut, was the first line of defense. It was 3 feet of dense fieldstone, granite and limestone, cold from the creek bed, dry stacked with a mason's patience. Ezra didn't use mortar for the structural integrity. He used gravity and friction. But the purpose of the stone wasn't just to hold back the hillside. It was to become heavy. In the language of thermodynamics, weight is stability. A heavy object takes a long time to change its mind about what temperature it wants to be. Ezra backfilled the gap between the stone wall and the raw earth with heavy clay, tamping it down until it was as hard as concrete. This created a continuous thermal bridge between the interior of the room and the deep, stable subsoil. But stone, for all its weight, was only the secondary system. The primary system sat lined up against that cold north wall, dark and imposing. He had scavenged 6 iron cisterns, 50-gallon drums that had once held oil. He cleaned them, painted them a flat, light-absorbing black, and lined them up shoulder to shoulder along the back of the room. Then, he spent a week doing the hardest work of the season, hauling water. He filled every barrel to the brim with river water. To the neighbors, this was madness. Water was the enemy in winter. Water froze. Water burst pipes. Water killed livestock if they got wet in a windstorm. Bringing 300 gallons of it into a root cellar seemed like inviting a flood. They missed the physics of specific heat capacity. Water is the most stubborn substance on the plains. It refuses to change temperature quickly, requiring far more energy to raise its temperature by 1 degree than dry soil, rock, or iron. But the inverse is also true. Once water holds heat, it fights to keep it. Ezra wasn't just storing water. He was building a thermal flywheel. By placing those black barrels in the direct path of the low winter sun, he was creating a battery that could charge during the 6 hours of daylight and discharge slowly, radiantly, over the 18 hours of darkness. The floor completed the circuit. Ezra laid down a bed of compacted gravel for drainage, then paved it with dark slate tiles he'd salvaged from a wrecked schoolhouse roof in the next county. The slate was dark, uneven, and dull, perfect for absorption. When the sun finally crested the horizon in late December, its angle was shallow. The light didn't hit the roof. It sliced through the opening and struck the vertical surfaces. It hit the black barrels. It hit the dark slate. It hit the rough stone. This was the charging phase. As the photons struck the dark surfaces, they converted from shortwave light radiation into long-wave thermal radiation. Heat. The slate floor absorbed this energy, warming up through the morning. The black barrels drank it in, the water molecules beginning their slow, invisible vibration, banking the energy. The air in the room didn't heat up because of a fire. It heated up because the room itself was becoming warm. The stone wall, the water barrels, and the slate floor became massive radiators. By 2 in the afternoon on a clear day, the air temperature inside would hit 70 degrees, even if it was 10 degrees outside. But the real magic happened at sunset. As the light faded and the exterior temperature plummeted, the battery turned on. The heat stored in those 300 gallons of water and tons of stone began to radiate back into the room. It was a gentle, relentless warmth. It didn't flicker like a candle or roar like a stove. It just existed, a steady pressure of thermal energy pushing back against the encroaching night. The room had momentum. It had the thermal mass of a freight train, and it would take days of absolute darkness to slow it down. But a battery is useless if the energy leaks out as fast as it enters. And Ezra had left one massive, glaring hole in his fortress, a hole he filled with the most fragile material on Earth. The hole in the earth was covered by 12 sheets of heavy, rolled plate glass. In 1887, on a homestead claim, this was an act of financial violence. Glass was for the wealthy merchants in Chicago or conservatories in New York, not for a dirt farmer in Nebraska. But Ezra had liquidated his savings, not for breeding stock, but for silica. This wasn't the thin, brittle windowpane glass you see in a farmhouse kitchen. This was industrial stock, 1/4 inch thick, heavy. It had arrived on the train from Pittsburgh, packed in crates of straw and sawdust, each pane weighing enough to crush a man's fingers. When you looked through it, the horizon didn't look right. It was wavy, distorted. This was before the invention of float glass, where tin baths made everything optically perfect. This was rolled glass, pressed between steel cylinders while it was still molten. It had bubbles. It had striations. It had the texture of frozen water. But Ezra didn't care about the view. He cared about the structural integrity. He needed glass that could take the weight of a 2-foot snow load without cracking. He needed a transparent shield that could shrug off the prairie wind. He set the glass in frames of rot-resistant cedar, using wet glazing. He spent days working a mixture of boiled linseed oil and whiting powder into a stiff putty. He packed this dough into the rabbets of the frame, bedding the glass deep into the wood. It wasn't just about holding the pane in place. It was about air infiltration. A draft is a thief. A single gap the size of a needle could suck the heat out of the room in an hour. Ezra smoothed the putty with his thumb, sealing the joint until the glass and the wood were one continuous, airtight skin. But glass has a fatal flaw. In the ledger of thermal resistance, it is a bankrupt material with an R value of roughly 1, a mere fraction of a sod wall's 20. While the glass successfully trapped shortwave solar radiation during the day, converting it to heat, that low resistance became a death sentence at night. As soon as the sun set, the heat inside would conduct right through the glass and vanish. Ezra knew this. That's why the system had a second layer. He had constructed a series of heavy wooden shutters hinged at the top of the frame. These weren't just planks. They were sandwich panels, filled with raw sheep's wool he had carded himself. Wool is a chaotic insulator. Its fibers trap millions of tiny air pockets, breaking the conductive path. Every evening at twilight, Ezra would go out into the cold and lower these shutters. He was closing the eyelids of the house. With the shutters down, the R value of the roof jumped from 1 to 10. He was locking the heat inside with the lemons. The structure became a thermos. The glass gathered the heat. The shutters kept it. It was a perfect loop, a machine made of dirt and light. But it relied on one assumption, that the glass would hold. If a hailstone the size of a hen's egg struck that quarter-inch plate, the system wouldn't just fail, it would explode. Ezra had built a warm, humid lung inside a frozen chest, separated by a brittle, fused layer of sand that could shatter in a single heartbeat. The system was theoretically sound, but the planes have a way of testing theories with brutal indifference. January 12th began with a lie. The air was soft. It felt like late April, not the dead of winter. The ground, which had been hard as iron for weeks, began to weep. The soil turned to grease. Men walked out of their soddies and shirt sleeves to check the stock. They looked at the sky and saw a pale, non-committal blue. It was the kind of weather that makes a man careless. It loosens the tension in your shoulders. You forget that the latitude hasn't changed. You forget that the calendar still says January. Inside the bunker, the thermal battery was working too well. With the warm air outside and the sun filtering through the rolled glass, the temperature climbed past 70. The lemon tree, a Meyer variety he'd raised from a cutting, didn't know it was in Nebraska. It only knew the heat and the light. It pushed sap. The tips of the branches, usually dormant and woody, swelled with green potential. Tiny white buds, tight as fists, began to loosen. The air inside didn't smell like a root cellar anymore. It smelled like wet loam and citrus oil. It was a pocket of impossible biology. The warning didn't come from the wind. It came from the pressure. Around noon, the air grew heavy. It pressed against the eardrums. Animals stopped moving. Cattle turned their tails north, sensing a vibration human boots couldn't feel. Ezra was down in the bunker, checking the water levels in the cisterns, when the light changed. It didn't dim gradually. It went flat. He climbed the steps and pushed open the hatch. The northern horizon was gone. In its place was a wall. It wasn't a cloud bank. It was a physical barrier of bruised purple and charcoal gray, stretching from the earth to the zenith. It looked solid, a mountain range moving at 40 miles an hour. There was no transition zone. There was the warm, soft air where Ezra stood, and then, a mile away, there was the end of the world. It was a collision of air masses so violent it generated its own static electricity. The sky crackled. Then the front hit. It didn't arrive with a gust. It arrived with a physical blow. The temperature didn't slide. It crashed. In the span of 3 minutes, the mercury dropped 18 degrees. The wet slush on the ground didn't dry. It flash froze into jagged ridges of ice. The rain turned instantly into ice needles, driven horizontal by a wind that screamed like tearing metal. Ezra didn't run for the house. He ran for the shutters. The glass. The glass was hot. The air was 40 below. The thermal shock alone could shatter the panes, but the hail was the immediate threat. He scrambled up the berm, his boots slipping on the flash-frozen mud. The wind tried to throw him off the roof. He grabbed the first heavy wooden shutter. The hinges groaned, stiffening in the sudden cold. He slammed it down over the glass. Then the next. Then the next. He fought a wind trying to peel the earth apart. His hands went numb, not from the cold air, but from the contact with the freezing wood. He dropped the last shutter into place just as the first wave of heavy ice slammed into the timber. The light inside was gone. He slid back down the slope and threw himself through the hatch, bolting the heavy door behind him. He sealed the tomb, locking himself in with the smell of citrus and wet stone. Outside, the atmosphere had ceased to be a gas and had become a solid abrasive. The settlers called the snow fine as sifted flour, but that was a domestic metaphor for a violent reality. It was ice dust, ground to the micron, driven by a wind that sustained 40 miles an hour. It didn't drift immediately. It flowed like water, seeking every crack in the claim shacks, filling the lungs of cattle until they suffocated standing up. The wind chill plunged past 40 below zero. It was a cold that shattered iron. The prairie was being scoured down to the bedrock. Inside the bunker, the violence was auditory. The wind roared over the hill, a constant, resonant vibration that shook the earth, but the air in the room was still. Ezra struck a match. The flame of the kerosene lantern didn't flicker. It flared orange, illuminating the glossy green leaves of the lemon tree and the dull black curves of the water cisterns. He sat on a wooden crate, watching the thermometer. This was the test. The math said the thermal mass would hold, but math is a clean thing, and a blizzard is a messy, chaotic variable. He watched the mercury fall. It dropped from 70 to 60 in the first hour as the residual solar heat bled into the shutters. 50 by midnight. Then 40. The cold was leaching in through the roof, fighting the heat rising from the floor. But then, the descent slowed. This was the thermal lag in action. The 3 feet of stone in the back wall began to pay its debt. It had spent months absorbing the temperature of the deep earth, and now, as the room cooled, the wall became a radiator. It was a massive, silent heater, dumping its stored energy into the air. The stone wasn't enough to stop the freeze. The temperature drifted down to 34 degrees. Ezra could see his breath in the lantern light. He looked at the water barrels. This was the critical threshold. He wasn't relying on the water to stay warm. He was relying on the physics of the phase change. To turn from liquid to solid, water must release a massive amount of latent heat, 144 BTUs for every pound that freezes. The barrels became a chemical engine. As ice crystals formed on the surface, the cisterns dumped heat into the room, locking the air temperature at exactly 32 degrees. It was a thermal plateau. The air grew stale, heavy with the scent of kerosene and damp earth, but it remained breathable. Ezra had buried a 6-inch clay pipe deep into the hillside, running 50 feet horizontally before turning up to the surface. This was the earth tube. The air entering the pipe outside was 40 below zero, lethal and dry. But as it traveled through the 50 feet of buried clay, the earth warmed it. By the time it trickled into the bunker through the floor vent, it had been tempered. It was a slow, passive lung, breathing for the room without admitting the killing frost. Above him, the storm did Ezra a final favor. The wind drove the fine snow into the gaps of the shutters, and the escaping heat melted it just enough to form a seal before it refroze. The roof became a solid block of ice, wood, and glass, an igloo cap that added one final layer of insulation against the void. The math said it would hold, but the cold of 1888 was an anomaly that defied standard calculations. Ezra wrapped himself in a buffalo robe and waited, listening to the wind hunt for him. He closed his eyes, trusting the water to give up its heat before the frost took the fruit. The wind didn't taper off. It quit. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It was the sound of a landscape that had been smothered. Ezra woke to a stillness so profound he could hear the blood moving in his ears. The thermometer in the bunker read 30 degrees. The water in the barrels had a skin of ice an inch thick, but the air remained just above the killing point. The phase change had held the line. He climbed the stairs to the hatch. It was immovable. The snow had drifted over the door and set like poured concrete. He had to unpin the hinges and pry the wood inward, fighting the weight of the drift until a wedge of blinding white daylight broke through. He tunneled up, dragging himself out of the earth and into a world that had been erased. The geography of the claim was gone. The fences were buried. The barn was a hump in the snow. The drifts weren't soft. They were hard enough to walk on, sculpted by the wind into waves that reached the second-story windows of the farmhouse. The air was crystal clear and bitterly cold, hovering at 20 below zero. The sky was a polished blue enamel, devoid of the violence that had birthed the drifts. Ezra walked across the top of his garden fence, without knowing it was there. The landscape was a blank sheet of paper, waiting for a history that had been frozen in place. He made his way to the neighbors first. The devastation was quiet. He found cattle standing in the lee of a windbreak, frozen solid, their breath stalled in their lungs. The sod houses, usually beacons of warmth, were silent. Chimneys were choked with snow. He saw the chimney of the Miller place, a cold finger of soot against the white. The tragedy of the schoolhouse blizzard wasn't just the cold, it was the suffocation. The wind had packed the snow so fine and so hard that it sealed livestock and people alike in white tombs. The active heat, the stoves, the buffalo chips, the coal, had failed. The fuel had run out, or the draft had choked, and the thermal bankruptcy of the thin walls had let the death inside. Ezra returned to the scar on the hill. It was invisible, a smooth ramp of white merging with the slope. He took a grain shovel and began to dig. He wasn't digging for shelter this time. He was digging for light. He located the cedar frame of the roof and scraped the ice away from the rolled glass. The sound of the shovel on the plate glass was sharp and unnatural in the muffled world. He cleared the first pane, then the second. The sun, brilliant and uncaring, struck the glass. Ezra dropped back down through the hatch and stood in the center of the room. The light poured in, hitting the slate floor. The room was cold, damp, and smelled of kerosene, but in the center of the gray stone and black iron, there was color. The Meyer lemon tree was intact. The leaves were a dark, glossy green, drooping slightly from the chill, but alive. And hanging from the branches were 3 spheres of bright, defiant yellow. The frost hadn't touched them. The water barrels had sacrificed their heat. The stone wall had drained its battery, and the earth tube had breathed just enough warmth to keep the cell walls of the fruit from bursting. It wasn't a miracle. It was physics. It was the specific heat capacity of water winning an argument against the Arctic wind. Ezra pulled a clasp knife from his pocket and cut the largest lemon from the branch. He sliced it open on the rough table. The juice ran onto the wood, smelling of acid and summer. He bit into the flesh. It was sour enough to make his jaw ache, bitter and sharp. It was the taste of success. It was the only living fruit for 500 miles. Ezra sat in the warmth of the earth, eating the lemon while the snowdrifts outside remained solid as stone. The world above was erased by white, but down here, in the dark, the air still smelled of summer oil. It wasn't magic. It was just a man who had learned to ask the earth for a favor, and knew exactly how much weight it would take to get an answer. If you value these accounts of practical wisdom, consider joining our community.